When the Cooper family first saw the house, they thought they were lucky. The spacious two-story cottage with a well-kept courtyard and large windows overlooking the green forest seemed like an ideal place to start a new life. Thomas, the father of the family, was delighted with the garage, where he planned to set up a workshop. Laura, his wife, immediately noticed the cozy kitchen with a large table where the whole family could gather. Their son Michael liked the backyard, where he already imagined how he would play with the dog. The family had long dreamed of moving from a bustling city to a quiet suburb, and this place looked like the embodiment of their dreams. The neighbors greeted them warmly. The day after we moved in, Mary and John Rivers, a middle-aged couple living in the house across the street, appeared on the doorstep. They brought a pie and offered to help with unloading things. "You've chosen a wonderful neighborhood," Mary said with a smile that questioned her sincerity. Laura noticed that the woman was slightly lowering her voice, as if she was afraid of being overheard. Over time, other neighbors began to visit them. Mrs. Howard, an elderly lady who always looked out of her window and knew everything about everyone. The Carter family, a friendly couple with 2 children. Mr. Hendricks, a taciturn man who lived across the street and rarely left the house. However, from the very beginning, something was bothering Laura in her new home. She felt like she was being watched. At any time of the day or night, as soon as she looked out the window, she caught movement in the direction of the neighboring houses. The people she saw from afar seemed to avoid her gaze. "Get used to it, honey, it's just a new environment," Thomas urged her, but she couldn't calm down. A month after the move, the Coopers began to notice oddities. One night, Thomas heard someone moving boxes on the porch, even though it was quiet outside. He went out to check, but found nothing. The surveillance camera installed in front of the entrance showed only a darkened spot on the recording, moving too fast to be seen. Laura saw Mrs. Howard standing motionless at the window of her house more and more often, and it began to frighten her. Every time Laura looked at her, it seemed as if she was studying her with her eyes. Mary River, who used to come often, suddenly stopped coming in. If Laura saw her on the street and tried to talk to her, she would find a reason to leave. One evening, Michael, returning with his bike, said that he had seen Mr. Hendricks burying something in his yard. "Mom, it looked weird." He kept looking back, the boy shared. Thomas laughed at this, saying that the neighbor might just have been planting flowers. But the culmination was the incident on Friday evening. Laura heard a knock on the door, even though it was already late. When she opened it, there was no one there except an envelope lying on the threshold. Inside was a note written in uneven handwriting. "Get out of here. It's not safe here. They're always watching." Laura showed the note to Thomas, but he thought it was someone's stupid joke. "The Carter kids must have been joking," he said, although Laura couldn't believe it. Every day the Coopers felt more and more pressure. One night, Laura looked through the window and saw John River standing in front of their house. He just stood there in the dark, looking right at her. When she called Thomas to look too, the man had already left. But everything changed when they found the second note. She was lying right on the table in their kitchen. This time it said, "You're in danger. Don't trust anyone." Laura couldn't ignore what was happening anymore. She insisted that Thomas check the locks on the doors and windows. "Someone was in our house, Thomas," she screamed, clutching the note in her hand. He reluctantly agreed, although he tried to remain calm. But even he, accustomed to logical explanations, could not find the reasons why the note ended up inside the locked house. The next day, Thomas decided to install additional surveillance cameras around the house. "Now we'll find out exactly who's joking here," he said, although there was no longer any confidence in his voice. Cameras covered every spot: the porch, the backyard, even the bedroom windows. A few days later, a camera in the backyard recorded something strange. When Laura was reviewing the recording to make sure everything was in order, she noticed a figure standing at the back fence. It was a man in dark clothes, with a hood over his head. He stood motionless, as if looking at their house. Then he turned his head and slowly walked away into the forest. Thomas sent the recording to the police, but they were told that there was not enough information on the video to identify him. After this incident, Michael began to complain about night sounds. "Mom, someone is walking under my window. I heard footsteps last night," he said at breakfast. Thomas decided to put a camera on Michael's window to calm his son down. That night, Laura woke up to a strange sound. Her heart skipped a beat when she realized that the sound was coming from the kitchen. Thomas was next to her, fast asleep, and she didn't want to wake him up. Gathering her strength, she took a flashlight and went downstairs. Everything was in place in the kitchen, but there was another envelope in the corner of the table. Laura's hands trembled as she opened it. This time, the note was short but scary. "You're next." Laura called Thomas, and he immediately called the police. However, the officer who arrived, having examined the house, did not find anything suspicious. He took the note with him, saying that he would give it for analysis, although Laura felt that this would not give any results. The Coopers began to notice that the neighbors were behaving more and more strangely. Mary and John Rivers stopped saying hello. Mrs. Howard was no longer looking out of the window, but Laura could see her whispering to other neighbors outside her house. Michael said that the Carter children no longer want to play with him, although they used to seem friendly. And then the dog disappeared. One morning, Michael ran out to the backyard to feed his dog, but he was nowhere to be found. Thomas and Laura combed the entire area, even contacted the neighbors, but no one saw their pet. That was the last straw. "We have to get out of here," Laura said, looking at Thomas. "These people, they're hiding something. It's not safe here." Thomas was silent, but for the first time, he didn't argue. At night, as the family was getting ready to sleep, Laura heard the camera alarm go off in the backyard. She opened the app on her phone and saw that several people were standing in the frame at once. They were all wearing black clothes and hoods. They were standing at the fence, motionless, with their heads down. "Thomas!" Laura shouted, showing him the phone screen. He ran outside with a flashlight, but when he reached the courtyard, there was no one there. The next day, the family began to pack. But the neighbors seemed to understand everything. Mrs. Howard came to their house as Laura was taking out the boxes. "Don't leave," she said softly, almost pleading. "It won't help." Laura didn't know what to say. Her horror deepened when Mrs. Howard added, "They're watching you. And even if you leave, they will find you." At night, the day before the move, fear literally hung in the air. Laura decided to sleep in the same room with Michael to make sure he was okay. Thomas stayed in the bedroom, saying that he should at least get some rest before the morning ride. But sleep did not come to either Laura or Michael. She could hear him stirring in the bed, turning from side to side. "Mom, why are they looking at us?" Michael suddenly whispered, turning sharply to his mother. "Who are they?" Laura asked, feeling her body start to get cold. "People outside the window," he replied calmly, pointing to a window covered by a thick curtain. Laura immediately jumped out of bed and slowly walked over to the window. Her hands were shaking as she pulled back the edge of the curtain slightly. And then she saw them. Shadows. 3 figures were standing on the lawn, right in front of their house. They were closer than in the last camera footage. These people weren't hiding anymore. "Thomas!" Laura screamed with all her might. Thomas burst into the room a few seconds later, holding a kitchen knife in his hands. He ran to the window and also looked at the lawn. The figures stood motionless, as if waiting for something. "Call the police, quickly!" He threw to Laura, but before she could dial the number, the lights in the whole house went out. In the silence that followed, only the sound of breathing could be heard. Laura held Michael close, feeling the boy tremble. Thomas headed for the door, trying to find a flashlight. "Don't move too far," she begged, but he wouldn't listen. Suddenly, There was a loud knock in the house. Bam, bam, bam. Someone was banging on the front door with such force that the walls of the house were shaking. Thomas froze in the hallway, looking towards the entrance. "Who's there?" "Stop it," he shouted, but the only response was another series of blows. Bam, bam, bam. The knocking grew louder, and then there was another one in the kitchen, where the back door was. "We're surrounded," Laura gasped, panic-stricken. Thomas desperately rushed to the door to try to look through the peephole. Laura grabbed his hand. "Don't. It's a trap." But Thomas came over anyway. He looked through the peephole and immediately recoiled. There are too many people," he said, his face turning white. At that moment, the glass on the kitchen door shattered. Laura screamed, and Thomas ran downstairs. He closed the bedroom door from the inside, leaving his wife and son terrified. "Thomas, don't leave us," screamed Laura, but he had already disappeared. She could hear his footsteps echoing below, and then the sound of a struggle. Michael began to cry, clutching his mother's hand tightly. "Mom, they're already here," he whispered, pointing at the door. Laura glanced at the crack under the door. Shadows. Someone was right on the other side. Laura squeezed Michael in her arms, trying to suppress the panic that was eating her up from the inside. The shadows under the door became clearer and clearer, like huge hands reaching out from the darkness to grab them. She could hear someone scratching on the walls outside. The sound was unnatural, almost mechanical, as if those who were behind the door did not understand what real flesh and skin were. With every passing moment, her heart was beating faster, her blood was pounding in her temples, and her breathing was getting heavy, as if the air in the room had compressed. Michael didn't stop crying. His hands were wet with sweat. Laura could feel her mind starting to lose control. She tried to speak, but the words stuck in her throat, and fear squeezed her insides like cold iron pincers. Suddenly, a new sound was heard. It was a knock, but not the same as before. It wasn't just a knock on the door. It was a knock right into her soul, powerful and painful. She heard a familiar voice, Thomas's voice. "Laura, Laura, don't open the door." Laura screamed, trying to hear more. But it wasn't his voice. It was distorted, as if something dark had captured him, as if her husband was screaming from hell itself. Michael cried even louder, feeling the same way. Mom, what is this? What's wrong with him?" His voice was full of horror and helplessness. Laura couldn't answer. It took all her strength to stay sane. She couldn't understand why the knocking wouldn't stop. Everything seemed wrong, twisted. The look at Michael, his tear-stained eyes, everything looked distorted, like in some kind of nightmare from which there was no way out. She looked at the door and saw how the lock on it slowly began to twist. Not mechanically, but as if someone had turned it from the inside, and with each revolution the metal mechanism made a hoarse, rasping sound. Laura took a step back, but her legs wouldn't obey her, as if she were standing still. Too much was happening in those few seconds. Someone knocked again, but now the sound was different. It did not come from the door, but from the corner of the room. Laura turned around and screamed. There was a man standing in the corner. A black hooded figure that seemed to blend into the darkness, with no face or body. She was still like a human, but not a human. The space around her became dim, as if the light in the room was dimming, being absorbed by this creature. Laura couldn't look away. Her body was paralyzed. Michael screamed again, but his scream died away, as if he had been swallowed up by the shadow itself. Laura stepped back and, not realizing what she was doing, retreated deeper into the room, unable to take her eyes off this terrible creature. "Thomas." Her voice was almost soundless now, and she realized she didn't believe he was still alive. Then the figure took a step forward. It was as if she had walked through space, like a shadow absorbing light. Laura felt her heart begin to slow down. The figure was approaching, but not a single sound accompanied its movement. And so, she stopped right at the door. Suddenly, there was another knock outside. But it wasn't a knock anymore. It was a sharp metallic screech. It was as if someone was trying to break down the door, forcing their way in. Laura froze, not understanding what was happening, but her eyes could no longer turn away from this figure. She was standing right in front of her. "Don't touch me." Her own voice startled her. There was no power in him. It was like a faint echo in an empty, shadowy world. The figure tilted its head slightly, as if analyzing it. Then, quite suddenly, she raised her hand. And Laura realized that it wasn't just a move. It was an invitation. And then, as if under the influence of some invisible force, she took a step forward. It was too late to realize that this step had led her neither to safety nor to salvation. The figure held out his hand, and Laura felt her mind begin to melt, like snow under the weight of a heavy shadow. At that moment, her soul was gripped by a horror so deep and frightening that she could no longer distinguish between reality and nightmare. Everything she had ever known about the world was gone. Her gaze froze in the void. And the next moment, she found herself in a place where there were no more walls, windows, or doors. Just an endless shadow that swallowed everything around. "You're next." Her mind was still repeating those words, but now they sounded like a final sentence. Laura gripped the door handle, her breathing coming in short gasps. She tried to control herself, but the fear building inside her left her with no chance of peace. Everything that was happening around seemed too strange, too ridiculous to be real. Every sound, from knocking on the door to footsteps on the stairs, echoed in her head. "Michael! Michael, can you hear me?" she whispered, trying to keep the panic out of her voice. But the boy was no longer responding. He was sitting on the bed, curled into a ball, his eyes wide open, as if he saw something that shouldn't be here. Laura shook his shoulder. "Michael, it's okay. It's okay." Her voice sounded hysterical, and she felt her own psyche begin to break under the weight of this nightmare. But suddenly the silence was broken by a new sound. It was strange, almost inhuman, sharp, like the rasp of iron on glass, as if something was collapsing in the very foundation of the house. Laura jumped up and pressed her hands to her ears, trying to muffle this terrible sound. But it was useless. He didn't disappear, nor did the sounds of footsteps, which now seemed more real. Laura's heart was pounding in her chest, and she couldn't figure out which of these things was real and which was a product of her own mind. It seems that her brain began to search for an explanation for all this madness, and at some point she realized that it was all too strange to be true. "This can't be real," she whispered, her voice low and shaky, as if she was trying to convince herself that what was happening just didn't make sense. She took Michael by the hand and began to look for a way out of the room, even though she knew that no door or wall would save them. But then something clicked in her mind, and everything around her began to change. The room in front of her blurred, the walls began to seem unstable, and the light in the hallway was dim and fragmented. Laura suddenly realized that she couldn't feel the floor under her feet or the stability in her body. It was as if she was hanging in the void. "It's a hallucination," she whispered, and her own words sounded strange in this world that was crumbling before her eyes. "It's all chemistry. It's just chemistry. We accepted something." Her mind exploded as she recalled the nighttime walks around the house, the strange smells they had smelled, and the unspeakable heaviness in the air that seemed to be accumulating every day. It was like a toxic atmosphere, like something that disrupts perception, fills every corner until you begin to doubt what you see and feel at all. Michael was too quiet, too still. Laura shuddered as she looked at him and noticed how his eyes had gone blank, as if he wasn't aware of what was going on around him. She reached out to him, but instead of feeling his warm skin, her fingers slid over the cold, empty surface. He disappeared. He just disappeared. And in its place, a void appeared, a gigantic void that swallowed up everything that was once familiar. Laura felt a sharp pain in her chest. She couldn't take this nightmare anymore. The pain was real. The hand clutching her throat was real. But this world, everything that was happening around it, was not reality. Laura took a step back and felt her own body losing control. We're poisoned. We're all poisoned. Her thoughts were confused, and only one question sounded in her head. How did they end up here, in this place full of hallucinations and destroyed perceptions? When her eyes opened again, Laura found herself sitting in the kitchen. Everything was quiet. The floors didn't shake, and she didn't hear footsteps. But there was a strange heaviness in the air, as if she had just been snatched from a dream, and the rest was nothing more than a nightmarish memory. She looked at Michael, who was sitting next to her, and there was no fear in his eyes, no pain, just emptiness. And then she realized they really were poisoned. But it wasn't ordinary chemistry. It was more than that. The strange things that happened to them were just a side effect. The place they were in hid its danger much deeper than she could have imagined. "We're not getting out of here," Laura whispered to herself. Laura sat there, feeling her body begin to tremble with anxiety. It was as if the very atmosphere of the house was squeezing her, forcing her to be on edge. Everything looked normal. The kitchen was the same as always. But something was wrong. She could feel it on her skin. And when Michael suddenly jumped up, her heart almost stopped. "Michael, what are you?" He slid across the floor, lost his balance, and fell into the kitchen with a crash. Laura rushed to him, but as soon as she got closer, she froze. Michael's leg was at the wrong angle. That's the moment when you realize that a tragedy has occurred, but your mind refuses to accept it. "Michael!" she screamed, but her voice was overshadowed by the sound of a crunching bone. He was trying to get up, but then Laura saw a long and brutal fracture break out of his right leg, from the place where the bone should have been. The bone pierced through the skin, sticking out with a sharp edge. Michael's moan was like a sound that couldn't have been made by a human, almost animal, driven mad by pain. Laura grabbed his shoulder, trying to help, but when her hands touched his leg, she felt the bone cut her fingers, causing her to jump away. Everything was happening too fast, and there was no room for thoughts in my head. She just stared at his leg as the bone came out even more, bending and bleeding. "No, no way!" Her voice pierced the silence. She tried to loosen his hip, but it didn't help. Michael was panicking, his eyes were widening, and his body was shaking. "What should I do?" Laura screamed, but all she got was a horrified look from her son. He couldn't speak, couldn't explain what was wrong with him. His breathing was heavy and ragged. She could feel his body starting to break out in a cold sweat. But that wasn't the scariest part. It wasn't just a horrific sight, the blood, the punctured skin, the pain squeezing her inside. No, the horror was that everything around her was starting to change. The walls began to pulse, as if the house had a life of its own. Every detail began to seem wrong, even scary. The air was blurry, like a hallucination, but she couldn't be sure anymore that it was all just chemistry. "Michael, hold on, I'll save you," she said, but her voice was empty. She didn't know how to get them out of here, how to save him. As if in response to her words, Michael's bone pierced through the skin with even more force, breaking everything in its path. She felt something hot burning her hands, and when she looked at his leg, she saw pieces of meat hanging from the wound, and the bone continued to grow, advancing through his flesh. Laura jumped up to him in a panic, trying to plug the wound with something, but it was too late. Blood flowed freely. She could feel cold sweat covering her body. Michael could barely stand on his feet. His eyes were full of fear. But it wasn't ordinary fear. It was something much deeper, something that threatened to consume them both. And Laura realized that no amount of help would save them from here. Everything they were going through was not an ordinary trauma. Laura looked at her son in despair, feeling the world crumble around her. She tried to find a way to help, but she realized that there was very little time. The blood continued to flow, and Michael's every breath became weaker. He couldn't stand anymore. His body was barely holding up. Next to them, somewhere in the shadows, she noticed a silhouette. Her heart skipped a beat, and her gaze immediately slid towards him. His face was hidden in shadow, but Laura knew it couldn't be accidental. He was approaching, and despite his appearance, there was something unnatural about his actions. It was as if he wasn't a part of this world. "You. What do you want?" Laura barely uttered the words, trying to gather her remaining courage. The man did not answer. His steps were slow and confident, but each step brought more fear. Laura felt her body refusing to move. She couldn't take her eyes off his hands, which were trapped by something metallic. Suddenly, he pulled out a pistol from his pocket. Laura didn't even have time to react. It all happened so fast. He pointed the gun directly at her, and she felt her heart thump harder. "Wait," she shouted, but the man wasn't in the mood for conversation. The next moment, a shot rang out. With a loud sound, the bullet pierced through the air and pierced into the body of the man standing next to Michael. He fell to the floor, his scream drowned in silence as the last spark of life faded from his eyes. Laura remained standing, shocked. She couldn't understand what had happened. It was all so fast, so scary. Only fragments of thoughts were spinning in her head, giving her no peace. The man with the gun turned to her. There was no joy or anger on his face. Just a cold, emotionless emptiness. It was as if he was part of all this horror, part of something that had no explanation. He raised the weapon again, aiming it at Laura. But at that moment, something strange happened. She felt the space around her changing, as if reality itself was beginning to distort. It was as if she was just a ghost in this world. And the moment her fingers slid over the pistol grip, she felt someone else's power emptying her soul. The gun in her hand shuddered, and another shot followed. The man did not have time to understand what had happened. He collapsed to the floor, and blood filled his eyes. Laura stood over him, her hands trembling, and there were no thoughts or words in her head. She only knew one thing: they weren't supposed to be here. But now she was forced to take this step. She turned to Michael. His eyes were already empty, and like the man's, blood was pouring onto the floor. It was all a painful nightmare. Reality was disappearing, and she remained in this house, surrounded by death and chaos.